Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry. I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, it is Halloween today, and I've been getting a lot of suggestions for Halloween-related topics to cover this year, and I decided to cover this one. This is about werewolves. And this is from the great folks over at Overly Sarcastic Productions. All right, I know nothing about the history of werewolves, so I'm super excited to check out what they got here. However, you know I'll be talking about any historical periods that they bring up and any questions I have along the way. All right, the original video is down below. Make sure you're supporting them. Overly Sarcastic Productions puts out some fantastic historical content. All right, let's check this out. All right, and I got my wolf shirt on. Spooky.
Welcome back, one and all, to the spookiest season of the year. Crisp autumnal magic is in the air, the moon is bright, the wind is howling, and it's the perfect time to dive into one of the most iconic Halloween monsters, the werewolf. Somewhere in the shadowy liminal space between animal and human, while the werewolf is simple on paper, if we take a closer look, we find a surprisingly complicated mess of tropes and existential questions about the nature of humanity itself, all tangled up in an oddly flexible figure that's filled a lot of roles over time. Now, werewolves, like vampires, are broadly common knowledge in modern pop culture, but their specific mechanics vary a lot depending on who you ask and who's writing them. Werewolves have a lot of associated tropes, but not a lot of internal consistency, which makes it a little difficult for me to give a snappy one-line definition we can work off of.
Yeah, we gotta get down to the truth of werewolves. No more crap, no more propaganda. I want the truth, baby.
The one consistent through line is that werewolves are humans who sometimes transform into something like a wolf. Some versions of werewolves
in the
transform
moonlight
exclusively during a full moon, triggered by moonlight, while some can transform whenever they want, and some can choose to transform except on nights of the full moon when they're forced to. Some turn into mindless monsters, while others stay totally coherent and in control. Some turn into full-on wolves, while some take a hybrid humanoid form instead. Sometimes being a werewolf is a transmissible curse that functions like a bloodborne disease transmitted by bite, and sometimes it's hereditary or done by magic or artifacts. Sometimes werewolves are practically unkillable except with specific weaknesses like silver or wolfsbane, but sometimes a regular bullet will do the job. And that's not even...
Okay, I get my historical knowledge about werewolves from two sources. All right? Teen Wolf with Michael J. Fox and the werewolves in Skyrim. All right, that's my background knowledge.
Even touching on the low-calorie werewolf tropes that get used in broader media, like giving characters wolf-like traits like fangs and claws, enhanced senses, social pack dynamics, and certain NSFW qualities that form the backbone of an entire genre of erotica I regrettably now know exists. But we've seen this kind of inconsistency before. Frankly, it's much more common for pop culture staples like these to have lots of internal variation than for them to have some kind of rigid canon defining how everything works. Fittingly, for creatures of such fundamental transformation, the werewolf has changed a lot over time. Today, let's trace that evolution and explore how the modern werewolf gradually took form. Now,
by the way, there's a term for that. They call it's called historiography in history. It's when it's not even necessarily that you study the history of something, but you study the history of something, how it changes.
like I said, it's not exactly easy to nail down what should and shouldn't constitute a werewolf. If we work on the popular modern full moon and silver weakness version, there are no werewolves before 1940. And even if we try broadening it to person who turns...
So that means in 1940, World War II caused werewolves. It's all making sense now.
Into a wolf, technically there's only a handful of werewolves after 313 CE. So let's loosen the definition significantly and just start looking for anything that kinda looks like a person who turns into
1330? Plague. That decade is when the plague really started to hit Europe. It's all coming together now, right? We got the plague. It's like it makes you turn into this monstrous creature when you have the plague, which can be likened unto a wolf. It's all coming together now.
We get a couple promising candidates in ancient Greece and Rome. In Herodotus' Histories, a record of local culture and history written in the 400s BCE, Herodotus describes the Neuroi, a tribe he locates around northern Ukraine who supposedly transform into wolves for a few days every year before changing back. Virgil's eclogues around the turn...
By the way, it's important to note that the Greeks did not look very kindly upon non-Greeks. The term barbaroi, as you can infer, you know, as origination of the word barbarian, is actually the origination of that. It's basically like it's a term that means like they're backwards. If you were a non-Greek speaking person, they kind of looked below you, because it's like, famously Greek city-states were competitive with each other and may not have liked each other and make fun of each other's culture, but they did almost have like a common like sense of cultural superiority over non-Greeks. So there you go.
Turn of the millennium feature a character
Herodotus
Morris,
shows a lot of
who uses
bias with that way
baneful
too.
herbs to turn himself into a wolf. And a few decades later, we get another casual werewolf in Petronius's Satyricon, where a character recounts a nighttime journey he took with a soldier who he later discovered was a werewolf. The soldier snuck off on his own, stripped naked, peed in a circle around his clothes to turn them to stone, then transformed into a wolf and ran off to kill some sheep. Ovid's Metamorphoses, right around the aughts CE, recounts the tale of King Lycaon of Arcadia, who tests Zeus's omniscience by killing someone, either a hostage or his own son, and serving him for dinner. As punishment, and Zeus transforms him into a wolf. That's all.
By the way, how many of you think these accounts was just some drunk dude that was seeing stuff?
Ovid has to say about it, but we're going to be hearing a lot more about Lycaon from now on, and about 100 years later, Pausanias' descriptions of Greece featured a more detailed version of the story, wherein King Lycaon founds the city of Lycosura on the mountain Lycaeus, founds the Lycaean Games, and gives Zeus the new epithet Lycaeus, which, for translation, is basically King Wolf founds Wolf City on Wolf Mountain and starts the Wolf Games in honor of Wolf Zeus.
So wolves.
Latin. Wonder what the twist is. Now, according to Pausanias, Lycaon was a contemporary of Cecrops, ancient mythical founder king of Athens, and that back in these days, humanity was kind of re-evaluating how to worship their gods. Cecrops had made the wise decision to pull back on the whole human sacrifice dealio, but Lycaon apparently decided to double down and honored Zeus Lycaeus by straight up killing a baby. Zeus didn't like that very much and turned Lycaon into a wolf as punishment. Pausanias thinks this is 100% believable and historical, but expresses skepticism about a follow-up piece of folklore that attests that every year at the Lycaean Games, someone is transformed into a wolf, but transforms back if they avoid eating any people for the next 9 years.
Seems
Pausanias
legit.
thinks that's just silly, but that first wolf thing was totally real. He's not the only historian to be selectively skeptical. A few decades earlier, Pliny wrote his Natural Histories in an attempt to write down the entire body of human knowledge all in one place, and in it, he laid out a somewhat different werewolf setup, though this one is also supposedly set in Arcadia. Pliny says there's a
Pliny is one of the most famous historians, by the way, that we have of Roman history. There's a lot of things that people refer to Pliny writings in. When you go to Roman history, there's a good chance you're gonna see something from
tradition
him.
in Arcadia where a young
So,
man is
so that means if he's talking about werewolves, yeah, that means he's right.
setup, though this one is also supposedly set in Arcadia. Pliny says there's a tradition in Arcadia where a young man is chosen by lot to dump his clothes and swim across a swamp, at which point he'll transform into a wolf. He'll then spend 9
Seems
years
legit.
as a wolf, and if he avoids eating any people in that time, he'll be able to swim back across the swamp to turn back. Pliny also mentions the whole festival of Zeus Lycaeus thing and brings up an actual historical dude, Demanitus, who was supposedly transformed into a wolf at a sacrifice to Zeus Lycaeus, spent 9 years as a wolf, turned back, and went on to become an Olympic prize-winning boxer. Forget doping scandals. From now on, this is the only sports controversy I care about. Now, at this point, we've
I
got
was gonna say it's literally performance enhancing drugs. We see an early version of it. Yeah, I know that the Berserker Vikings had that, but let's go even further back with werewolf tendencies. Of course, that's gonna make the Olympians good, dude. That's just like OP, overpowered.
pretty recurring themes. There's some variation, some of these werewolves are transforming at will or with the use of magic herbs, but most of these stories involve the transformation being some kind of divine punishment, usually from Zeus, and a very specific 9-year timeline of being stuck as a wolf before changing back in the 10th year, and only if the werewolf didn't hurt anyone, making the whole thing functionally a test of character. These werewolves also unilaterally turn into proper wolves, no wolf-man hybrids in sight. And that is pretty much the Roman consensus on werewolves until around 313 CE, when a funny thing happened. Emperor Constantine started to think this hot new Christianity thing was sounding pretty sweet and decided to pump the brakes on oppressing them and look into joining them instead. Now around 410 CE, another
made it legalized Christianity when it pretty much had become like there was really no choice but to do it, you know, despite the up to that point, like 300 years of effort or whatever of trying to kind of suppress Christianity and keep it illegal as it conflicted with Roman beliefs. Right, because that was kind of the policy for Roman subjects was, you know, especially if you were like a foreigner that was conquered and became one of the provinces, was basically, you know, they didn't really care if you kind of worship your own gods, but you did have to kind of worship the Roman gods and pay tribute to the emperor as well. And Christians found themselves incompatible with that as they're monotheistic. But then, so he legalizes it and converts actually much later in his life towards his deathbed, actually. By the way, one other thing I'm interested to hear, and we'll see if they get to it, is if the werewolf stories are mostly like Western, okay, kind of like Western ones, do we have any that come from Asian cultures or anything like that, or African cultures? I'd be interested to know, and we'll see if obviously if they bring that up. But that'd be interesting to know.
Another funny thing happens. Rome gets sacked by the Visigoths. This bums out the Romans in general, especially the Roman Christians.
Them Germanic
worried that
tribes.
this sudden spate of bad luck might be divine punishment for their conversion. Sensing unrest,
They were
Bishop
werewolves.
Augustine of Hippos decided to assuage those fears by writing the City of God in 426, which surprisingly has a lot to say about werewolves. See, at the time,
Rome was sacked by
everyone kinda
werewolves.
just believed werewolves existed. It was one of those common knowledge things. But believing in werewolves had been deemed unchristianly, since a werewolf was presumably not transformed by God and thus shouldn't be able to transform at all because that would require power that only God has. This is going to be a recurring problem for the burgeoning religion, and Augustine decides he's the man to tackle it. He brings up several now familiar bits of werewolf lore: the Arcadian swamp, Demanitus the boxer, all that good stuff. Augustine admits that categorically denying these claims is kind of tricky because there are plenty of people who will swear on their lives that they either saw a werewolf, know someone who saw a werewolf, or even are a werewolf. Augustine thinks this is all pretty stupid and frankly impossible, but struggles to reconcile this with the fact that
The voice
with
of
God, all
reason.
things are possible, and the big man has a habit of working in mysterious ways. The implication is that a werewolf could exist, but only if God was cool with it. Augustine does think, however, that the idea of a human physically transforming into a wolf is impossible. What Augustine does think is possible is that a person could be put into a deep magical trance, their dream self could be extracted from their body, magically transformed into a wolf easily because it's just a dream, and then phantasmally projected out into the real world where other people can see it. I love a simple solution. Believe it or not, this hot take basically turned into the official church doctrine on how werewolves worked. They weren't actually werewolves, they were just hallucinating so hard that everyone else started hallucinating too. Now,
I figured maybe it'd be like they'd attribute it to demonic possession or something like that. So my whole life, ever since I was a little kid, I think it's called a lucid dreamer, where I'm dreaming, but I'm awake. And I'm awake and cognizant of things, but I'm actually dreaming, and there's like another reality happening with me. I've had it ever since I was a little kid, and to be honest, I still kind of have it. It's not quite sleepwalking because I'm aware of it. And at some point I snap out of it, and I'll be like, wait, there's not a bunch of people in my room that I'm hanging out with or something like that. And then I'm like, oh, I'm not outside right now. You know what I mean? Something like that. So I wonder if, why I said that is I wonder if I'd lucid dream hard enough that I could like become a werewolf.
Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, the official Christian stance on werewolves didn't actually matter all that much to most people, even after the broader Christianization of Europe. Plenty of the werewolf literature from this era has almost nothing to do with whether believing in werewolves is technically heresy or not. For instance, in 1188 CE, Archdeacon Gerald of Wales writes the Topographica Hibernica, an account of the landscape of Ireland that includes an anecdote about a priest who encounters a wolf in Ossory who can speak and tells him he's really a human, and that his people were cursed for disrespecting a saint, so that every 7 years, 2 of them have to take the form of wolves for the next 7 years, changing back if they manage to survive. He asks the priest to help his companion, a sick she-wolf who wants to be given her last rites before she dies. The priest reluctantly obliges, and the author contemplates the ethics of the whole situation, bringing up Augustine's assessment of the whole transformation versus illusion dilemma, and concluding that God could totally make a werewolf in the same way he could make Lot's wife into a pillar of salt or water into wine. Gerald briefly considers where transubstantiation fits into this and decides it's probably safest not to touch that particular theological mess, which is honestly hilarious. On a similar
It kind of makes sense if you look at like transubstantiation and stuff, like the, water turning into the blood of Christ, or the, bread to the actual body of Christ or whatever. Something that just crossed my mind is, do you think there's any connection with this, especially the I don't know, respect or whatever to wolves coming from the Roman origin story with Romulus and Remus being kind of like raised by a wolf, like a wolf mother? That just kind of came to my mind. What do you think about that?
similar note, the Norwegian text King's Mirror in 1250 tells that when St. Patrick came to Ireland to try and convert the locals, he was met with particularly ferocious opposition from one clan in particular, who drowned out his sermons by howling like wolves. Angered, St. Patrick prayed for God to punish them, and apparently the big man decided to approve the werewolf thing just this once, because the clan is cursed to turn into man-eating wolves every 7 years. Both of these stories seem to tie into the werewolves of Ossory, a supposed lineage of people descended from Leinek Felav. Leinek Felav. Felav.
I feel something like that.
Guys, I'm really sorry. I looked up how to pronounce this, and there is literally no pronunciation guide for this anywhere on the internet. Normally,
is it like Gaelic?
There's something, but Leinek Felav is the one guy who's got no pronunciation guide online. Okay, he's described in The Fitness of Names as a man who could turn himself into a wolf and would go hunting with his family, and he later produced a whole line of people who could turn into wolves whenever they wanted. It's interesting to note that the Irish text about this frames the transformation as voluntary, while the Welsh and Norwegian versions make it a curse as punishment for defying the Christian God. Now at this point, werewolf lore has shifted a bit. The classic version, person who can turn into wolf, still exists, but because of Christianity's fundamental beef with the base concept, wherever those werewolf stories bump up against the spread of Christianity, they get reworked to fit. In this model, werewolves can only exist as illusions or divine punishments. The 10 to 1200s
Protect your own
breaks this
interests
rule with
there.
a few explicitly heroic werewolves, most of which follow one plot structure. The anonymous Breton Lay of Melian and the poem Bisclavret, written by Marie de France, both pop up in the 11th century and describe a heroic warrior and friend of the king who is secretly able to transform into a wolf, but can only change back if he has access to his clothes or a magical artifact. His wife learns of this, traps him in wolf form, and runs off with another man. The werewolf, stuck as a wolf, eventually finds his king, who finds this mysteriously tame wolf strangely endearing and fiercely loyal, so the wolf becomes the king's constant companion until he eventually encounters his wife and her new husband, attacking them and forcing him to confess the truth to the king. The werewolf is restored to human form and everyone winds up happy. In Bisclavret, the werewolf is just some cool baron guy, but in the Lay of Melian, the werewolf is an Arthurian knight and the king is King Arthur. Another French poem from this era, Guillaume de Palerme, I'm also saying that wrong, features a similar werewolf in a supporting role. He's been trapped in wolf form by his stepmother and helps the heroes, who in turn help him win back his kingdom and get him changed back. Now,
I need to do more looking into like King Arthur stories. You know, one thing I'm fascinated in history is you look at like these almost like mythological type characters. And what can be interesting is if you can find information about the origin of those, because it's believed by many that a lot of mythological stories like Greek gods, Greek heroes, just as an example, but then someone like King Arthur originate with like from real people. And then over time, their stories get so large and kind of spin out of control through especially oral traditions that all of a sudden they become these just larger than life characters. And I've heard that about King Arthur, that he may actually been like a Romanized, soldier and had success, in England, because again the Romans colonized that. So, and just anyways.
Werewolves are broadly notably absent from most Norse and Scandinavian literature, unless you kind of stretch the definition of werewolf to include person who wears a wolf pelt and acts like a wolf without actually transforming. But there's a pretty classic werewolf story.
People most likely to be werewolves.
Volsunga saga, where two characters find enchanted wolf skins that turn them into wolves until they manage to remove them. The werewolves in this era strike an odd balance. It's not consistent whether or not their transformation is a curse, even in the space of a single story. These werewolves often initially transform willingly, but are then trapped and can't freely change back. They're all intelligent, and several are surprisingly heroic, although Melian does kill a bunch of people while he's a wolf, so it's not like they're strictly unproblematic. At least in Britain and France, being a werewolf seems to just be a thing that some people are. A surprisingly neutral and even positive framing.
You can't control it.
Loaded concept. But unfortunately, the fun times screeched to a halt in the late 1400s. The problem is, while it might have been the official church doctrine that werewolves were ultimately mostly fictional and or harmlessly delusional, the actual beliefs people generally held got a little bit contradictory.
Again, it's 1400, so it's like, I think the Renaissance ruined it. All that humanism and rational thinking started to ruin the great lore of the werewolf. You know what I mean? They had to ruin it. They were like the Renaissance. The Renaissance thinkers were the Buzz Killington of their time period.
Since the root doctrine was the idea that it was impossible for people to derive real power from pagan sources because capital G God was the only real God, it followed that it was heretical to believe that anything pagan could have real magic behind it. In 785, the Council of Paderborn made it actually illegal to accuse anyone of witchcraft because good Christians didn't believe in witchcraft. This changed at the end of the medieval period, where witchcraft was recharacterized as a form of heresy and thus both dangerous and deserving of capital punishment, which was really catalyzed in 1486 with the publishing of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum. You may have heard of this book as the Hammer of Witches, almost single-handedly responsible for kicking off the witch hunts and, by extension, the brutal and tortuous deaths of something like 30,000 innocent women conservatively and something on the order of 10,000 innocent men. And you might have entertained the idea that the dude who wrote it maybe didn't have the healthiest attitude towards women overall, and you would not believe how right you were. To make
This book is giving a bad name to books. Books are supposed to make us smarter and less dogmatic. And a book like that is ruining it. Okay. Era of the post-printing press here. So now all the first books that people are getting of the many that you could get, it could be, scientific journals and all this stuff and history and geography, and then throw in a witch book and it just ruins everything.
A very long story short, the year is 1485, the place is Innsbruck, Austria, and newly arrived churchman Heinrich Kramer is already having some serious problems with Helena Schuberin, a local woman known for having opinions and being unafraid to share them, which is always a dangerous combination.
That means she's a witch.
Helena is deeply unimpressed with Kramer, calling him a bad monk and in league with the devil, and refusing to go to his sermons
She must be a werewolf.
Absolutely rancid vibes. Kramer responds by putting her on trial for witchcraft. Helena is found innocent, in large part because Kramer is obviously obsessed with her, and the bishop ends up calling him out for his wildly unfounded claims and tells him to back off. Helena
Amazingly, this is what carries over all the way to the 1600s and like the Salem witch trials. It's like you're a strong-willed woman with loud opinions. You must be a witch and be inspired by the devil.
moves on with her life, and Kramer does not, haunting the city for the following year, investigating witches and stalking Helena until the bishop finally kicks him out. Kramer responds by writing the Malleus Maleficarum, a book about how women are super incredibly evil and in league with the devil and need to be tortured and killed about it as quickly as possible. Judge Claude Frollo wishes he had what this guy had. The text was described by contemporary theologians as unethical, illegal, and actively heretical, but it was unfortunately very influential on account of being 98% fear-mongering.
Inquisition, they brought up all that
which has a very high success rate at convincing people to do terrible things. Despite the controversy of the text within the church and the fact that from the moment it was published, people realized it was going to hurt a lot of innocent people, Kramer still managed to sway public opinion and stoke terror that witches were very real and very powerful and had to be stopped at any cost, especially if that cost was torturing and killing a lot of women. Man, I am just so disappointed to learn that the inventor of the witch hunt was a terrible person. It's just every time, Do you guys think we could separate the art from the artist? Now, while the witch hunt era was mostly fixated on witches, werewolves came up too, although not as much as you might expect. While witches were consistently considered very real problems worth murdering about, the through line still seemed to be that werewolves were a bridge too far, and were probably just being deluded by the devil into thinking they were wolves, and were at most simply covered in the illusion of a wolf. Still, there was some argument about this. Many contemporary texts and sermons back up the delusion and illusion version, but others say that werewolves could transform through a potion or a trinket given to them by the devil himself, which was similar to how they believed witches could supposedly fly. Around this time, werewolf was also being used as a synonym for serial killer. In 1589, German farmer Peter Stubb was tried for murder, cannibalism, incest, and a whole bunch of other stuff, broadly under the umbrella of being an evil werewolf, and was executed on Halloween. Now,
interesting. So you're not considered actually to be a werewolf, but you act like the conceived notion of it. So it just becomes like a turn of phrase or like a metaphor. It happens a lot with the evolution of words, where we use words when you actually break down their root and like original meanings don't make sense anymore.
While he's commonly described as a werewolf cannibal serial killer executed for an array of horribly lurid crimes, it is important to note that he admitted to said lurid crimes under torture, and his confession included practicing black magic since he was 12, turning into a wolf using a magic belt, and boning a succubus, all of which seem rather unlikely. Between that and the records of the actual investigation being sparse to non-existent, we literally have no idea if he actually did anything wrong. His daughter and mistress were also executed for his alleged crimes, so that's pleasant to think about. Today's hot take: the witch hunts were bad, actually. Surprisingly, this era also saw a few self-proclaimed werewolves.
Finally,
in the late
2023,
northeastern Italy had the Benandanti, who claimed to be good werewolves who fought witches. Instead of physically transforming, they turned into animals in their dreams and traveled in spirit form to fight witches, protect harvests, and occasionally travel into hell to bring back supplies that were stolen by demons.
She said that was Dante, like Dante's Inferno and stuff like that, which is a big driving force on the idea of hell as this punishing, fiery, place of fire and brimstone and all that stuff. Hey, but finally we got somebody advocating for the werewolves. All they've been doing is getting a bad rap here. All right, somebody is finally defending the werewolves.
This was dope as hell, so obviously the witch hunters were very suspicious. But since the Benandanti were very insistent that they were warriors of God and fighting the real bad witches, this legitimately seems to have thrown the witch hunters off their game enough that they mostly just dismissed them as harmless. Even kind of annoying, since the Benandanti would regularly accuse other people of being evil witches they'd fought in their dreams. A few decades after the Benandanti faded out of focus, an 80-something man in Jürgensburg, Sweden, claimed before a judge to have been the same kind of heroic werewolf, serving as a warrior of God and battling witches in his dreams. The judge was less interested in his werewolf thing and more interested in how he hadn't been going to church regularly and had been practicing folk healing for the locals, so the dude was flogged a little and banished for life. Obviously a completely just and proportionate response. Thankfully, the whole witch hunting thing gradually wound down during the 1700s, but the effect it had on the popular image of werewolves was severe. Arguments over heresy aside, werewolves were now characterized as completely in control of and responsible for their transformation, gaining their wolf form through deals with the devil and being fundamentally evil and corrupt. This era did also have the hidden undercurrent of the wolf warriors of God thing, but they were pretty severely overshadowed by the satanic devil werewolf version. Werewolves in this era were thought to transform either through trinkets like fur belts or wolf skins, or through illusions that just made them look like wolves. And that's where werewolf lore stayed until 1897, when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. Now, we all remember Dracula.
Bram?
Archetypical vampire, classic gothic horror, there's a cowboy in it, all that good stuff. But while Dracula...
He already ruined the he ruined the good sainted name of Vlad, right? Vlad the Impaler, right? The crazy thing is, the interesting thing is like the actual Vlad was like worse than the Dracula from the Dracula story actually tamed it.
Dracula is a vampire. There's plenty of werewolf stuff in his book. Dracula says outright that werewolf legends were inspired by him and his family, and the suspicious peasants Jonathan Harker keeps brushing off call Dracula something like Vilkolak, which Jonathan says means either werewolf or vampire interchangeably, but actually just means werewolf. Essentially,
vampire
Dracula
werewolves?
is a vampire. I'd argue he's even the vampire. Functionally speaking, Dracula is also a werewolf. It's like he's a point of convergence that lets some traits bleed over from one archetype to another.
Dude.
He can transform into a wolf at night and at noon, and he also controls wolves, though they seem to find him fundamentally wrong and very unnerving. The moon is also prominently referenced several times in the book.
What's the moon thing? I'm going to go back here and make sure I understand this, but what's the moon thing have to do with it?
Mentally wrong and very unnerving. The moon is also prominently referenced several times in the book as having some kind of connection to his powers, although that might just be gothic horror flavor text. It's a little hard to tell. On that note,
is that where the moon thing originated?
Has not factored into any of the historical werewolves we've dealt with till now.
Oh,
and
okay.
There's been another popular modern werewolf trope conspicuously absent: the idea of lycanthropy as a transmissible ailment. Cursed or not, none of the werewolves we've talked about so far have been contagious. But after
I like that it actually has like a scientific term, lycanthropy, lycanthropy for wolf. It's like that's its own field of study and categorization.
Dracula and his charming habit of cursing people by biting them, that changes. In 1935, we get Werewolf of London, the first surviving Hollywood movie to feature a werewolf, in which the protagonist is bitten by a werewolf and over the 3 nights of the full moon transforms into a surprisingly dapper wolfman.
And a great song later on.
Murders uncontrollably until he's shot and killed by a policeman in the finale. This theme pops up again in 1941's The Wolfman, the movie that really solidified the modern image of a werewolf. Another one transformed by bite, affected by the full moon, and this time vulnerable to silver, another new addition to the lore courtesy of Hollywood. These movies also feature humanoid werewolves rather than full transformations into quadrupedal wolves, possibly for special effects practicality reasons. After the wolf,
I need to watch the Universal like monster movies way more. They're such a staple like of American film culture and like mythology that I need to pay my respects by going back to that stuff. It's public? Is it like public domain now? Something we could do watch parties on or something?
Wolfman, werewolves got locked into pop culture as tragic, cursed monsters, transforming by the full moon into Wolfman hybrids and functionally unstoppable except by silver. A trait which, fun fact, was given some retroactive legitimacy in the 1940s when French author Henri Porat wrote a somewhat fictionalized retelling of a real historical thing that happened in 1764. A series of deadly animal attacks terrorized the French province of Givaudan. What most likely happened was that there were several wolves or wolf-coyote hybrids or other canine critters in the area. They were hungry, they occasionally attacked, and they were gradually whittled down by hunters until the last one was killed in 1767. What people thought was happening was that there was one unkillable beast of Givaudan they kept hunting and killing, and it kept coming back for more. Witnesses also insisted it was like a wolf, but not a wolf, which, real talk, is one of my favorite horror tropes. I love it when the only way people can describe something is by listing the familiar things it's not. Anyway, the beast was finally killed in 1767 by a local hunter, Jean Chastel, using what were, by all accounts, perfectly normal bullets and a perfectly normal gun. Well, Porat's version is a bit more spiced up than that. Porat attributed Chastel's final victory over the beast to silver medallions of the Virgin Mary that he melted down into silver bullets with which to finally slay the creature. Since he was writing this in 1946 and the Wolfman had come out in 1941, this definitely didn't originate the idea of werewolves being vulnerable to silver bullets, but it certainly helped reinforce it and add a veneer of legitimacy to the idea by giving it some retroactive historical clout. Now,
Where is the statue? This is awesome.
Helped reinforce it and add a veneer of legitimacy to the idea by giving it some retroactive historical clout. Now, before we get fully into the modern werewolf,
in my
there's
yard.
one very important facet of their characterization that we have completely neglected, namely actual wolves. The pop culture interpretation of the werewolf is naturally going to heavily rely on the pop culture opinion of wolves in general, and until fairly recently, that opinion was not good. There's been a handful of heroic wolves in folklore. The she-wolf that raised Rome's founder Romulus and Remus is probably the most well-known example, but for the most part, wolves in folklore are bad news. Wolves in sheep's clothing, the boy who cried wolf, the big bad wolf, Aesop's fables about shepherds trusting wolves. Wolf was practically fable's shorthand for villain. When
Beowulf.
English colonists first came to the Americas, wolves had been extinct in England for over a century, but were alive and well in North America.
They all turned into dogs. All the actual wolves that didn't domesticate, they were all killed off, and the good boys turned into our friendly dog companions, which, by the way, my dog is super needy right now. He's down below. I don't know if you're hearing him grunt, but he is absolutely demanding pets while I watch this entire movie.
Other native inhabitants of the continent, the colonists wanted them gone. Wolves were scary, and for those new settlers, they also presented a broader threat, not because they were attacking them, but because they attacked their livestock, which was usually big, dumb, slow, and already caged for their convenience.
True.
With starvation already a very real threat for the colonists in those early years, this immediately put wolves pretty high on their shit list and inspired the first of many extermination campaigns, which are exactly as bad as they sound. See, back in ye olden times, Joe Colonizer wasn't exactly familiar with the concept of a trophic cascade and assumed most problems were simple and self-contained and could be easily solved by simply killing everything involved. Until the early 1900s, the actual stated goal of this push was to drive wolves to extinction. Now, the fact is, wolves are not really all that dangerous to humans most of the time.
Yeah.
Wolves basically don't attack humans unless they're sick or starving, or they've been habituated to lose their wariness of humans, and wolf packs usually top out around 8 members, most of them not even adults. But if there's one thing we know about horror, it's that humans fear the unknown, and after those first few extermination campaigns, wolf encounters were rare enough that they were almost completely unknown to your average Joe Colonizer, both because their numbers were dropping and because wolves were hiding from humans more.
Wolves almost have to have they actually have to be sociable because of their pack mentality. If a wolf is selfish, overly aggressive, and can have those traits, they can be kind of banished by their wolf pack. And if that happens, they have a hard time surviving on their own. They need each other. So like you could see how wolves also, very tame wolves and had inherent traits that allowed them to be near humans and not act in like a feral nature. They become our ancestors of our dogs, right? So it makes sense, and that may be able to explain again why there is that misconception about them being especially dangerous to humans.
And now that wolves were more elusive, they were more unknown, and thus way scarier. In the 1700s and 1800s, stories about wolf attacks got exponentially more sensationalized. Wolves weren't just hungry and dangerous, they were also morally evil and actively treacherous somehow. Stories of wolf attacks wouldn't just involve dozens of wolves, but massive packs of hundreds of starving creatures all hell-bent on hunting down innocent mothers and children in the snow. Some contemporary natural histories even insisted that wolves reproduced unnaturally quickly, and only constantly murdering them was keeping their numbers down. This frankly ridiculous swath of misinformation was finally undercut ever so gently in 1944
Anti-wolf
when American
propaganda.
wildlife biologist Adolf Murray decided to actually try studying the darn things in the wild. He found that wolves don't see humans as prey and actively avoid them whenever possible, that wolf packs usually stay small because they're too territorial to form large groups, and most importantly, that wolves are actually good for prey populations in the wild by keeping their numbers manageable, preventing overgrazing and subsequent starvation from the environmental damage. This didn't reverse the wolf's bad rep overnight, but it definitely flipped the narrative. By 1973, the Endangered Species Act declared that maybe genociding an entire species just because we don't like them is bad, actually, and introduced actual legal protections for wolf populations that had been whittled down to almost nothing.
Wolf pelts
this decision
and stuff.
was not unilaterally popular because 400 years plus of bad press doesn't just
Look at these posters. Wolves are not endangered. Come on, let us kill the wolves.
disappear overnight, and some people
Who's
really like
doing
shooting
this?
wolves, but it was a good
Wait,
step.
what was the little girl? What was the little girl's?
100 years plus of bad press doesn't just disappear overnight, and some people
I want to shoot an elk with my daddy someday. Okay, I don't want to talk about wolves there, but The
really like
wolves.
shooting wolves, but it was a good step. This also led to a preliminary look into how wolves socialize, leading to the whole alpha wolf concept, which was, fun fact, misleading enough that the same researcher who popularized
only be
it
one
later
alpha.
disowned it, because the idea that some wolves were alphas implied a strength-based dominance hierarchy and some kind of fundamental alpha trait.
Can't
that
be a
made
bunch
some
of them, or
wolves
they
better
get kicked
than
out of
others,
the
where in
pack.
actuality, the observed pack alpha wolves were literally just the parents of the rest of their pack, in charge not because they were powerful and dominant, but because they were mom and dad. Then in 1995, wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone, giving them a protected area to repopulate and avoid getting shot in, and by all accounts, that's going really well.
love seeing
Now,
the wolves
obviously,
in
wolves
Yellowstone.
aren't, harmless.
Beautiful.
They're wild animals, they're predators that hunt to survive, and those teeth are not just for decoration. But now that they're actually being studied, they're not unknown horror monsters either. And
By the way, okay, so I like going to Yellowstone. Don't be the people that like stop the traffic and then like get out of their cars and try to get all close to the animals, wolves being one, but then you'll hear these stories of idiots going out there and like trying to get up to buffalo and stuff. There'll be this mama buffalo who's like trying to get across the street with her babies, and then you hear about some, buffalo or something charging somebody. Like, leave the animals alone, please. Like, observe them in their natural habitat, away from your influence, please.
the shift in the pop culture attitude towards wolves has been mirrored in a shift in werewolf characterization. Early Hollywood werewolves were compassionate, tragic humans overwhelmed by a monstrous, mindless beast, driven to murder by uncontrollable animal instincts, mirroring the popular attitude towards wolves at the time.
love acting
Modern
in these
werewolves
videos.
usually still have an element
that-
of that beast
wait,
within
he's not
concept,
Teen
but
Wolf?
not always. Some werewolves retain the historical concept
I need a
that their
Teen
minds never
Teen
change
Wolf
when they transform,
clip
and they're
sometime
still
here.
fully human on the inside, only physically changing. In others, the beast thing doesn't do much to affect their behavior, but will play into a usually outdated model of wolf social hierarchies. Pack loyalty, alpha wolves, lone wolves, all that good stuff. The idea that wolves are
Yes!
inherently evil has
There
withered
he
away,
is.
and as a result, the wolf side of the werewolf is losing that implication too.
Okay, now they need to make sure. I hope y'all, if you haven't seen Teen Wolf, the best scene of the movie, surfing on top of that car. He's the wolf and he does car surfing. It's so good.
Still wild, but they're not necessarily villainous. The modern werewolf is a flexible beast. There's a solid 2,000 years of lore to draw on, but no universally accepted canon to be limited to, so when a writer wants to write a werewolf, they can pick and choose the traits they want to use. And what traits get used usually reflect what story they want to tell.
Win-win.
The classic Hollywood horror werewolf was pretty popular for a few decades, an innocent human cursed with a horrific and painful transformation, trying very hard not to kill people once a month. And those werewolves were almost always basically mindless rage monsters when they transformed, strongly affected by the full moon. But the tragic monster version has been largely phased out more recently in favor of a less categorically antagonistic version. Many modern werewolves are in at least partial control of their actions when transformed and can shift at will, with the more emotionally volatile parts of the character leveraged for drama rather than tragedy. Despite that flexibility, there's a few traits that have become staples of the modern werewolf. Silver bullets, the full moon, bite-based curse transmissions, some degree of animalistic or feral behavior. But even then,
Which I found interesting because most of those are very, very modern, it sounds like, from what she's been saying. Basically, from Bram Stoker's Dracula and onward.
and no two werewolf stories handle them quite the same way. Some stories stay pretty close to the middle of the bell curve, with werewolves that change under the full moon into wolfman hybrids and shrug off anything south of a silver bullet. Underworld, Van Helsing, and about a million others play into this version, but plenty of stories get creative with the concept, like Wolfwalkers, a recent movie that combined three very different pieces of werewolf lore from three very different eras. First, the base concept is the werewolves of Ossory, the Irish lineage of werewolves we mentioned. Second, the witch hunt era concept of the Benedonti and the wolves of God, astrally projecting their dream selves in the shape of
Sorry
wolves
about
rather than
butchering the
physically
Dante
transforming
thing
into wolves.
earlier.
And finally, the post-Dracula idea of werewolves creating more werewolves by biting people. The Wolfwalkers, first shown in the movie, are an Irish mother and daughter protecting a forest from a nearby English town trying to clear-cut it. They manifest wolf forms when they sleep, an ability that turns out to be transmissible by bite.
Dude, this looks cool. I love the art style of this story. I gotta find this out.
There's a few other features, magical healing
Find it.
abilities, controlling wolves, and a lot of the later stock werewolf
That's
tropes
really
are
cool
noticeably
looking.
absent, like the silver vulnerability or the moon factoring into anything. Like I said at the beginning, it's never been easy to nail down what should and shouldn't count as a werewolf, and that's continued into the modern day. Plenty of stories feature characters that could be argued as werewolves, but their power set might have almost nothing to do with their folkloric basis,
Yeah, they're lame.
which, as we've
Poser
established,
werewolves.
is itself a long-standing tradition. Almost none of these historical werewolves have anything in common with each other. I think this is mostly surprising because werewolves seem really basic on on paper. It's kind of weird to think that such a simple monster concept has this
Basic.
much going on.
Mid.
And yeah, they're basic,
mid.
but it's because they're basic that so much about them is flexible. The base etymology of the word werewolf is literally just man-wolf. Beyond that, anything goes. What makes the man-wolf a man-wolf? What connects the man and wolf? Is it a divine punishment, a magical disease, a bond with the changing face of the moon, an artifact infused with wolfness, a simple magical quirk of the bloodline? How do the man and the wolf interact? Are they at odds?
We all
In
have a
sync,
wolf
at war?
inside of
Is
us,
the man
already.
lost in the wolf? Is the wolf just another side of the man? Is the wolf the man's shadow? Is the wolf the man's freedom? The nature of the werewolf is defined by their duality, but what exactly that duality means is completely up to the storyteller. And that is why werewolves are objectively cooler and more interesting than vampires. Yeah, I said it. It's about time someone did. Hope you got your thing.
All right, are you team vampire or team werewolf? Comment down below. All right, final thoughts. Big shout out to Red from Overly Sarcastic Productions. This was such a dense video of lore and history. This was top tier, like the incredible job done here. This was so cool. I learned so much about werewolves there. So that was kind of cool. I can, maybe this is actually me inside here. I'm the fire werewolf like that, but excellent job there. Hope you guys were able to enjoy some of my commentary and inserting some historical things along the way, but absolute shout outs to OSP over here. Again, this video is linked down below. Make sure you give it a view. Okay, even if you've seen it, let's make sure we get a view. Subscribe to their channel, like their video for this awesome content. All right, and with that, y'all, have a fun, safe Halloween. We'll see y'all next time. Bye.